Hey there, Professor Baobab here, and today I wanted to reveal a quick report on some of the philosophical discoveries regarding Kyurem, the Dragon Ice type, the boundary Pokemon. Kyurem is a legendary Pokemon and is a member of the so-called Tau trio, which includes Reshiram and Zekrom. Today I wanted to explain what the role of Kyurem is in this Tau trio. Eons ago, legend has it that Kyurem, Reshiram and Zekrom were fused into one Pokemon, the original dragon as it were. But there were two young heroes, and these heroes had separate intentions. One believed that absolute truths should govern everything. The other believed that ideals of humans and Pokemon should strive to be as one in the world. And so, after some time, this mythical dragon split into two Pokemon. Actually, three. One sought after truths along with the hero of truth, and that was Reshiram. The other sought after ideals. That Pokemon was Zekrom, and it sided with the hero of ideals. Where does Zekrom fit into this then? Well, Zekrom unfortunately has been given a bad reputation. People tend to call it a husk of the original body. But I hope to convince you that Kyurem is actually more than that, as I discovered. And in fact, Kyurem seems to be more than even the sum of each of the parts. I suspect that the original dragon would have been much more powerful than both Reshiram and Zekrom combined. Much more powerful than even Black Kyurem and White Kyurem, a result of so-called Absol fusion, thanks to the use of DNA splicers on Kyurem, in the presence of Reshiram or Zekrom, respectively. So you could say that my objective with this report is to exemplify that Kyurem is not a husk. In fact, it is not only a husk, but it is also everything that makes Zekrom and Reshiram meaningful. I can certainly appreciate why people call Kyurem a husk. After all, it looks damaged, broken even, like something that was once whole but now is not. It looks broken also not cleanly. It looks like it was severed, like when you drop glass and it shatters. The reason for this, as I will soon reveal, is not because Kyurem is indeed a broken Pokemon, but because Kyurem is enshrouded with a thick layer of ice. Now, this ice is a unique type of ice because it isn't the same kind of ice that you'll just put into a glass of water, for example. According to a recent breakthrough in quantum physics, I hypothesize that Kyurem has the ability to reduce its core temperature to absolute zero, which is the temperature at which entropy reaches its minimum value. Entropy is classified as a state of disorder in the universe. The lower the entropy, the more ordered something is. That is to say, the more orderly is the arrangement of particles in a substance. For example, ice will have a lower entropy than water, and water will have a much lower entropy than steam. With Kyurem though, it has an ice that could reach a temperature of absolute zero, I suspect, which would mean that virtually all motion would cease. And the reason why it's not all motion, technically speaking, is because of a phenomenon known as 0-point energy. And it's this 0-point energy that might define the entire nature of Kyurem. If you try to zoom in on a particle, the more accurate you try to measure its momentum, the less you know about its position. With Kyurem, it's in a juxtaposition, a superposition of possible states. Because at absolute zero, its particles can either have a well-known position, for example, if they were perfectly still, but then you would know little about its momentum. And so Kyurem could be in this state where its momentum could have a variety of values. And it's this variety of values that could give it quantum leeway of either being in a state of truth or in a state of ideals simultaneously. That's why 0-point energy has to exist. And with 0-point energy, Kyurem's potential is unknown. In my understanding, it's actually unlimited. And here's why. For Kyurem to be able to bring down its core temperature to absolute zero means it must be able to decrease its entropy to a minimum value. But the entropy of the surroundings is much higher. So where is it pulling that energy from? For example, with quantum computers, it's quite difficult to get from 200 Kelvin to 10 Kelvin. But it can be just as difficult to get from 10 Kelvin to 3 Kelvin. And it can be even more difficult to get from 3 Kelvin to just 1 Kelvin. And so we see that it exponentially becomes more and more difficult to reduce the temperature as the temperature gradient increases. For Kyurem to be able to accomplish this feat, it would need a tremendous amount of energy at its disposal to essentially extract energy from the surroundings, which is always there, thereby reducing the entropy of the surroundings. But then the entropy of the universe must always be increasing. And so at the same time, it must be somehow releasing heat. Now, the way that I propose that it's doing this is that while it's in that superposition of states, on the one hand, it's reducing its core body temperature to absolute zero. And on the other hand, it's actually not even changing at all. How does that work? Well, there's an idea among scientists that time behaves differently at quantum scales. So at quantum scales, which is the result of being at absolute zero and manifesting that 0-point energy, although the 0-point energy is always there, it's just that it's constrained by quantum effects. But also the fact that Kyurem can exist in this quantum superposition, it is suggested, it is implied that time freezes. But obviously time is immaterial, so it kind of makes no sense. But just consider that if time stopped moving, just like in a singularity in a black hole, if time stopped moving, then it would actually make no difference whether Kyurem had limitless energy or no energy at all, because anything and everything would happen.
This is going to sound strange, but obviously you probably know that absolute zero is theoretically impossible. So why am I talking about this so much? Well, there are two possibilities here, and admittedly I'm rather alone in this field, as most people don't really understand Kyurem and aren't willing to try to understand Kyurem, because it doesn't make sense how it seems to be this broken creature. After all, we humans don't look broken, no other Pokemon really looks broken, and if they do, then it's clear and understandable why they look that way. But with Kyurem, the fact that they can fuse with Pokemon already is something far-fetched and unprecedented in the natural world. But let me give you my two predictions in this regard. The first is that Kyurem, or rather the original dragon, was purposefully created by Arceus itself. So in the beginning, when time was meaningless, really, Arceus created the original dragon to be frozen in time. Or perhaps more specifically, to have a heart frozen in time, and that heart was the embodiment of Kyurem. Obviously, being a complete dragon then, there was no real distinction between Kyurem and regular Dekrom. But if that was the case, then obviously Absolute Zero could have applied then, because the laws of physics didn't need to make sense. There were no laws to begin with. After all, time was not a construct yet. The other proposition is that it's probably less meaningful, it's more paradoxical, and that's the idea that Kyurem had experienced already the heat death of the universe. In the instant Kyurem became dismembered from the original dragon, because it was in a constant flux between realities in this quantum superposition, it could have been in an infinite number of realities. And so in one of those realities, surely it would have experienced the heat death of the universe. And the heat death of the universe is in some incomprehensibly large time scale in the future, sometime in the future. But with infinite possibilities, that time could be now. So with this manifestation of Kyurem, it would have had the minimum amount of entropy, which would have obviously corresponded with absolute zero. And so that version, that realization of Kyurem is what we may be encountering today. And that might be because that's the only form of Kyurem that is ultimately stable. obviously being like a damaged Pokemon. Well, perhaps that makes sense. Perhaps you still need some convincing. So, well, let's go further. Let's explore a little bit why Kyurem can exist the way it is, but also can undergo this absol-fusion process where it fuses with Reshiram or Zekrom. I've already mentioned 0-point energy. 0-point energy is really just the energy of nothingness. Technically, there are virtual particles that don't really exist, but are simple manifestations of the emptiness that exists. It's a strange thought, but remember, emptiness is still something. And so it's not just a philosophical case, but it is a quantum reality that there is something in nothing. So with Kyurem, there is something in nothing, within nothing, the nothingness of absolute zero, of frozen time, not experiencing time in the same way as other Pokemon. And so what that means, or at least what it suggests, is that Kyurem actually has limitless energy. Because if you consider that it is in this quantum superposition, still, because obviously with the position being almost well defined, you can't rely on understanding anything much about its momentum. And so it's in that quantum instability. And so it is like, you can imagine that it's flitting between different realities. And when it's observed, then it settles into one reality, one of those realities, and the reality that is of most concern for all intents and purposes is that of Reshiram and that of Zekrom. So, truth or ideals. Kyurem by itself is actually unbiased. It is like a mirror. A mirror by itself is just there, but you could have an ugly person or an ugly Pokemon look into the mirror, or you could have a beautiful Pokemon look into the mirror. So the mirror doesn't really do anything by itself until you have that other party, that other creation that fits with the mirror, that is compatible with the mirror, to determine essentially I want to have an outcome that could change the course of time, the course of history. So for example, if you look into the mirror and you find yourself ugly, well, that would become almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you will go about your life thinking that you're ugly, and that will affect your decisions. But then if the same person looks into the mirror and thinks of them as beautiful, well, they're going to have essentially an entirely different life. So in that junction, you can have two branches of life, which is a quantum superposition, until you look into that mirror. And so with Kyurem, you have a similar context where, depending on whether Kyurem fuses with Reshiram or Zekrom, its life is in a superposition of states. It could venture off into striving to meet ideals, or it could desire to harvest the truths in the world. So let's suppose that Kyurem does have unlimited energy. Okay, why is it not using it. It's just sitting there lying dormant, like a dormant volcano in the Great Chasm in Universe. What's it doing? Well, here it is. Kyurem is a husk, but in the sense that it cannot use energy. So, just like the shell of a walnut cannot be used for anything, it is quite literally worthless. You cannot eat the shell of a walnut. By the very fact that it is in this quantum superposition, it has no motive, effectively, to use its energy. And also it's of absolute zero. At least its core temperature. So if its core temperature is of absolute zero, then it makes sense that its energy is completely stored away, even if that energy is infinite. Because with absolute zero, there is no distinguishing between infinite energy and zero energy. So we get to see now, for the first time, that Kyurem is the embodiment of nothing and everything at the same time, which is, to me, quite the strong realization. It's quite counterintuitive as well, how nothing can also be everything. But consider this now. Why does Kyurem need or even want to fuse? First of all, Kyurem can obviously stay the way it is, and it can use certain moves, certain dragon type moves, certain ice type moves. This has been recorded, and we did indeed see a great play of this when Gates tried to overcome the world using Kyurem, but its energy was forced into being used because of the motives of the human who was controlling it. Remember, Kyurem itself doesn't have motives. So Gates observed Kyurem, and that observation caused the so-called wave function, which is a quantum function which describes the likelihood that Kyurem could be in any particular state at any one time. That wave function would collapse to meet Gates' needs, and so Gates was able to use Kyurem in the case that we saw for actual evil intentions. Thankfully, Gates was penalized for his actions, but once Kyurem was disbanded, Kyurem actually had no further motive, no further agenda, and so it's no longer needed to use any move. It makes you wonder, if Kyurem did have some sort of free will, if it did have some sort of motive, would it want to use its energy, or would it be perfectly content with its current state? After all, it does have limitless power, so does it really need to showcase that it has limitless power? And this brings us nicely into the idea of absolute fusion.